Today we're going to look at financial ratios. So first of all, get a generic overview of ratios. So what are ratios? Ratios describe the relationship between different items in the financial statements. So then how do we decide which ratios to calculate? The skill in deciding which ratios to calculate and examine in order to provide more information on financial performance. So when we use ratios, there are certain assumptions that we make. So what are these underlying assumptions that we make when doing financial ratio analysis? The first underlying assumption is that we must always compare like with like. The second assumption is that we must be aware that ratios can sometimes disguise trends. So we need to take these ratios with a pinch of salt. And we also need to review the underlying data and not just the ratios. So before we can proceed further, let us look at some definitions of ratios, because it is important for us to identify how the ratio is defined. Please keep in mind there are many acceptable definitions, and you need to be certain that you understand which definition has been used. Next, we will look at the broad categories of ratios. Basically, there are four broad categories of ratios. The first category of ratio, which is commonly used, is what we call as profitability ratios. So what do these ratios measure? They measure the ability of the company to generate profit. So later on, we will go into more detail about the makeup of these profitability ratios. So the most important thing to keep in mind is that profitability ratios measure the ability to generate profit. The next broad category of ratios are the liquidity and working capital ratios. Basically, these ratios measure the ability to utilize working capital efficiently and settle short-term obligations. So again, this is just the broad overview. So in a subsequent class or lecture, we will go into the detailed makeup of this category of ratios. The next broad category of ratios are what we call long-term solvency ratios. So what do we mean by the term long-term solvency ratios? Basically, these are ratios which measure the ability of the company to settle long-term obligations. So just to recall, in the balance sheet, when we define long-term obligations, the cut-off is 1 calendar year. So any liability that is required to be settled after more than 1 year, 12 months, we would consider as a long-term obligation. So long-term solvency ratios measure the ability of the company to settle what we describe as long-term obligations. The next broad category of ratio are shareholders' investment ratios. Now, these are very important ratios because shareholders are one of the important stakeholders in any company. In fact, we often refer to them as the primary stakeholder. So what do these category of ratios measure? They measure the ability of the company to generate returns from the shareholders' investment. So this, as I've explained earlier, is very important because at the end of the day, this is what the shareholders are very keen to know. How much do they get for every dollar or every ringgit that they invest in the